Okay. Good afternoon and welcome. A special greeting to those who are joining us for the first time. Feel free to raise a thumb up on your screen or say a brief hello in the chat. We always like to hear from people who are wandering in and finding us for the first time. I'm David Carlson, the founder and the convener of the 3E Forum. We've been at this since January 2014, meeting once a month during the academic year to engage important and timely public policy issues involving the 3 E's: ethics, ecology, and economics. Since the beginning of the year, climate change has been a major theme, January, February on that. And then in March, turning to forests, lungs of the planet and cities. And then last month, regenerative agriculture, healthy soils, and working lands. So this month, ta-da, slide, Paul. This month, we are delighted to have three outstanding presenters who are going to help us engage food systems and food insecurity in Colorado. And hopefully everyone can see, but I'll read the names. Julia Char Gilbert, Policy Analyst for the Colorado Health Institute. Wendy Moschetti, Director of Strategic Initiatives with Nourish, Colorado, which used to be Live Well, Colorado. And Dr. Becca Jablonski, a food systems economist from Colorado State University. And you'll hear a little bit more about each one of them right before their presentations. But next, I'd like to show slides with some of the guiding questions that have helped us put the afternoon together. And hopefully you can see them all, but for those who are perhaps phoning in, how extensive is food insecurity in Colorado? That's what we're going to begin with. And then what do we mean by the concept of food systems? What are the components of that? And then how are the two related, this grip? And then the $64,000 question I'd like to pose that for me hovers over the entire afternoon. And that is, how is food insecurity for hundreds of thousands of persons in Colorado even possible in a state where per capita personal income is over $60,000. And this was the case even before the pandemic hit last year. This is information that comes from the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado Boulder. Each year they put together the annual Colorado Business Economic Outlook Forum report, and you can look it up there. This is a question for me that's stunning, and one of the motivators for reaching out to these three outstanding panelists who can help us wrap our heads around such a question. Okay, now just as to how the afternoon is going to unfold. First of all, anytime you have a comment or a question, please post those in the chat, and they will be monitored by my good friend and colleague, Paul Belanger. Paul, light up your screen if you would. Paul is a retired geologist and paleoclimatologist who recently moved to the Puget Sound area. Their gain is our loss, but Paul has been with us each month in this venue. Paul is the 3E Forum webmaster. He's a past presenter on biochar and other climate-related topics, and has really been involved in the design and the implementation of the forum from day one. So, Paul, many thanks for your contributions over the years. Now, after we hear from each presenter, we'll give them the opportunity for some informal dialogue. We get to listen in, of course. They may have some, comments on each other's presentations and so on. And then we will turn to the questions from the audience. And so let's begin now with some background information about our first presenter. Julia Char Gilbert is the lead author of the Colorado Health Institute's recent report, An Uneven Burden, Food Insecurity in Colorado. As a CHI policy analyst since 2019, she conducts research, analysis, and evaluation on issues such as food insecurity, school-based healthcare, and the direct care workforce. Julia also analyzes Colorado policy and politics as a member of CHI's Legislative Services team. So would you welcome Julia Char Gilbert?
Thanks so much for that introduction, David. Let me just share my screen here. All right, can you see that all right? Great, thank you. Great, well, thanks for that introduction, and thank you all for taking the time to be here today. As David said, my name is Julia Char Gilbert. I'm a research analyst, or a policy analyst rather, at the Colorado Health Institute. As David mentioned, I do research on a number of different areas at CHI, but I'm particularly interested in health equity and how social factors like food access influence our health. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk a little with you all about a recent analysis I conducted on food insecurity in Colorado. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Colorado Health Institute, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan health policy research organization. We conduct research and analysis related to health and health policy in Colorado, and we also do things like evaluation and facilitation and convenings. So if you have any questions about CHI's work or opportunities to partner with us or what have you, definitely feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to connect offline. So just a little on the plan for today's discussion. I'd like to start with just a couple minutes talking about the Colorado Health Access Survey, or the CHAS, which is the survey behind the data I'm going to be sharing today. We'll then take a look at what data from the CHAS tell us about the connections between food insecurity and health, and the disparities we see in who's experiencing food insecurity in Colorado. I'll also briefly share some data from Hunger Free Colorado that capture how the pandemic has impacted Coloradans in recent months. And then as David shared, we'll have plenty of time for discussion following all of the panelists' presentations today. If you guys have questions as I go, feel free to drop those in the chat. I will do my best to monitor them. And if I'm not able to answer them on the fly, I'm sure we'll have ample time to go through the chat as well once the presentations have officially wrapped up. So let's talk a little about the Colorado Health Access Survey, which we at CHI fondly refer to as the CHAS. The CHAS is a survey of 10,000 Colorado households that CHI conducts every 2 years since 2009. The data we're looking at today come from the 2019 CHAS, which was conducted between February and June of 2019. And the CHAS touches on a wide range of topics, including access to healthcare and health insurance and affordability of care. And in 2019, we added a number of questions related to social factors that influence health, including food insecurity. So that's the data we'll be talking about today. One thing I want to underscore about the CHAS is that it is a public good, which is to say that data from the CHAS are available to use by the public, and we really want you to use these data as a resource. So we have all the data available for download on our website, coloradohealthinstitute.org. And if you take a look at our publicly available data and they don't quite meet your needs, our team can also provide different cuts of the data or additional data upon request. So always feel free to reach out to me or one of my colleagues if we can help you with any any of your data needs, whether it be related to food insecurity or another health-related issue in Colorado. Now, some of you may have noticed that this date range precedes the COVID-19 pandemic, which is an important observation in that, as we all know, sort of the world looks really different than it did 2 years ago. So understanding where this data comes from and when it was collected is important to keep in mind as I head into my findings. In particular, I want to note that we know that food insecurity has increased following the onset of COVID-19, as many Americans have experienced job loss or wage loss due to the pandemic. And we also know that the pandemic has exacerbated many existing inequalities, and unfortunately, food insecurity is no exception. So while a lot of the data that I'm sharing today are quite troubling, I would say, these numbers actually likely understate the magnitude of the current problem of food insecurity, which is something to keep in mind. I do still think that these data are useful, though, in that they capture what the landscape looks like in Colorado prior to the pandemic. So as we work to support those most impacted by COVID, these data can provide insights into where the burden of food insecurity is felt most acutely in the state. I'll also note that the 2021 CHAS is currently in the field, so we will have new up-to-date data in-house later this year, and we expect that those numbers will provide really important insights into how the pandemic has affected Coloradans and has affected their health. So stay tuned for that. That'll be in-house probably around the fall. So with that, let's turn to our findings here. First, I want to define what I mean by food insecurity for the purposes of this presentation, because food insecurity can be defined in a number of different ways. So the 2019 CHAS asked respondents, in the past 12 months, did you ever eat less than you felt you should because there wasn't enough money for food? And if the respondent answered yes to this question, they were considered to have experienced food insecurity in the past year. And so what we learned in 2019 is that 1 in 10 Coloradans had experienced food insecurity in the past year, 9.6%. Now, there are a lot of reasons why people should care about food insecurity and why people should be concerned by that statistic. One of which is that research has shown strong associations between food insecurity and suboptimal health outcomes. This is one of the reasons why food insecurity is of interest to our team at the Colorado Health Institute. We see this association reflected in the CHAS data as well. So if you take a look at this figure here, people who experienced food insecurity in the past year are represented in orange, and those who did not are represented in gray. And what we see here is that people who experienced food insecurity were 3 times more likely to report experiencing poor or fair general health. They were also 4 times more likely to report poor mental health and 3 times more likely to report poor or fair oral health. And in addition to food insecurity being a health issue, I want to spend most of today talking about the ways in which it's an equity issue, in that we see that some groups are disproportionately affected by hunger in Colorado. So I'm going to walk you through some of these most pronounced disparities now. So first, and perhaps unsurprisingly, we see income disparities. So Coloradans with lower incomes are significantly more likely to experience food insecurity than their higher earning counterparts. So here we see that 1 in 5 Coloradans earning below 200% of the federal poverty level experienced food insecurity in 2019. And for reference, in 2019, 200% of the federal poverty level, or FPL, that was about $52,000 for a family of 4, or $25,000 for an individual living alone. So I now want to look at rates of food insecurity by region. The CHAS reports data by Health Statistics Region, or HSR. HSRs are basically regions that the state uses to organize and report on health data. And so you can see these HSRs, these regions outlined on this map here. And here is our food insecurity data for 2019 by HSR, Health Statistics Region. Just to orient you to this map, the darker shades of orange represent regions where food insecurity impacts a greater proportion of residents. The lighter shades of orange represent areas where food insecurity impacts a smaller proportion of residents. You'll also see these lines, this hashing. HSRs that are considered urban have hashing on them. Rural areas of the state do not. So two quick takeaways from this map, just at a glance, really high level. The first is that all areas of Colorado are affected by this issue. And the second is that there is quite a bit of variation across the state. So to try to get a better sense or a better understanding of what we're looking at here, one thing we can do is break down the data by urban and rural designation. And what we see is that Coloradans in rural parts of the state experienced food insecurity at slightly higher rates than those in urban parts of the state. That said, urban and rural Colorado are not monoliths. So for example, if we look on the Eastern Plains, HSR 5 shown here and HSR 6 just to the south are both considered rural areas of the state. But food insecurity in HSR 6 is nearly 4 times greater than the rate of food insecurity in HSR 5. So in 2019, about 1 in 6 people in the southeast corner of the state reported experiencing food insecurity, making it one of the regions most affected by this issue. So let's take a look now at food insecurity by age. We see that young adults ages 19 to 29 years old experienced food insecurity at higher rates than other age groups, according to the 2019 CHAS. So 16.3% of young adults, or 1 in 6 young adults, had experienced food insecurity in the past year. So this is perhaps a population for folks who are doing anti-hunger work at the community level to keep in mind in their efforts. One other note on age before we move to the next slide. Our estimates for children 0 to 18 years old are pretty conservative relative to other data sources. And that's likely due to the way that we defined and asked about food insecurity in the CHAS versus the ways that other data sources have done so. So as I mentioned, the CHAS asks parents whether in the past year their child ever ate less than they felt they should have because there wasn't enough money for food. That's a pretty narrow set of criteria, and it's also capturing a pretty significant degree of food insecurity. Meanwhile, if you were to ask a parent whether, if they ever worried whether their money would run out or their food would run out rather before they got their next paycheck, for example, which is a different way of asking about food insecurity, you can imagine that more parents of children might respond yes to that question. So that's why we likely see this relatively low estimate for 0 to 18-year-olds here. So I guess this is a caveat that ultimately when you see here that about 4% of Colorado children experienced food insecurity, the takeaway should not be that barriers to accessing food only affect a small minority of children in Colorado. That's not the case. Rather, this means that about 50,000 children did not have enough food to eat because their families could not afford to buy more, and that there are thousands of additional children who are living in households struggling with other forms of food insecurity as well, who aren't necessarily represented here. Okay, so I want to turn now to talk a little about racial and ethnic disparities, which are particularly profound and particularly concerning. So due to systemic racism, communities of color are disproportionately affected by food insecurity. We see this in the United States and we see this in Colorado specifically. So according to the CHAS in 2019, Black or African-American Coloradans were nearly 3 times more likely to experience food insecurity than non-Hispanic whites, and Hispanic or Latinx Coloradans were nearly twice as likely. At 22%, that means 1 in 5 Black or African-American Coloradans experienced food insecurity in 2019. So I want to pause here to have us reflect on these numbers for a moment, because I think many of us have seen a lot of charts that look something like this, and maybe have grown accustomed to seeing racial and ethnic disparities in data as normal or predictable, or even inevitable. And I want us to resist the normalization of these types of inequities, and instead reflect on why we see these disparities, because these types of inequities are not predestined. People of color are not simply predisposed to poor outcomes, right? There are structural reasons behind the disparities that we see in charts like this. So I think it's important to proactively remind ourselves of that. In this case, racial and ethnic disparities in food insecurity are the product of long and enduring histories of structural inequality and discrimination in domains like employment and housing and transportation and food systems, and the list goes on. So in Colorado, we know that Black and Latinx people are disproportionately impacted by poverty. And we know that even controlling for economic factors, some communities of color continue to encounter unique barriers to accessing affordable, healthy foods in their communities. So for example, some studies have found that in predominantly Black neighborhoods, they have significantly fewer supermarkets and access to fresh produce than predominantly white neighborhoods, even controlling for income. Because of sample size limitations, we're not able to speak to rates of food insecurity among racial and ethnic groups that aren't on this slide at this point in time. But because we have data coming in from the 2021 CHAS, as we have more data in-house, we'll be able to report out on more groups. So I'm feeling hopeful about being able to sort of take a closer look at racial and ethnic disparities for others as well, hopefully later this year. Okay, so as promised, I want to close with some more recent data to give us a sense of sort of how the pandemic has impacted food insecurity in Colorado, because we know that this continues to be a significant issue, and the pandemic, in fact, has exacerbated many of the challenges and disparities that I've described. So these numbers come from Hunger Free Colorado's COVID food insecurity survey. So when the pandemic began, Hunger Free Colorado started doing quarterly surveys of about 500 Coloradans to assess how food insecurity was changing during the pandemic. So their most recent survey, for which there's data publicly available, is their December 2020 survey. And in December, they found that about 38%, or 4 out of 10 Coloradans, were experiencing food insecurity. That's pretty astounding. So this is the highest rate that Hunger Free Colorado has recorded since the onset of the pandemic, which I think is also important to note, that things have not necessarily gotten better in recent months. And for comparison, Hunger Free Colorado reports that about 13% of Coloradans experienced food insecurity during the Great Recession. So the enormity of the challenge that we're currently facing really is somewhat unprecedented. Hunger Free Colorado also found profound racial disparities, with about 30% of white Coloradans reporting food insecurity, compared with 52%, so over half of people of color. So while we look at this 38% aggregate number, it's really concerning in and of itself. When we take a deeper look at this disaggregated data by race and ethnicity, we see that it's masking really alarming disparities there as well. Hunger Free Colorado also reports data out by age, and they found that young adults, so folks under 45 years old, were more likely to report food insecurity compared with older adults. This is likely in part because a greater proportion of young adults were affected by job loss and by wage loss related to the pandemic. So those are just some high-level findings from their more recent data set, but if you're interested in taking a closer look at those numbers, they have all of them available at hungerfreecolorado.org, so quick plug for the excellent work that they're doing. Likewise, all of the information from the Colorado Health Access Survey that I shared today is also available in this report on CHI's website, which is coloradohealthinstitute.org. I'll also share links for both of those resources in the chat in a moment here. I also welcome you to reach out directly to me or a member of my team if you have any questions about what I've described today, or the work the CHI does, or what have you. Really anything, I'm always happy to connect. But yeah, in closing, I would just underscore that food insecurity really is an equity issue, and it's going to take ambitious and tenacious work from folks working in food access and in agriculture and in public health and in policy and in organizing and really all sectors of society and at all levels, to ensure that folks really have the food that they need to live healthy lives, not only during the pandemic, but also in the months and years to come. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and for your interest in this topic and for the work that you all do in your respective communities. And I'll pass things back to David to keep us moving forward.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And I would just invite you to take a minute to touch the reactions button at the bottom of your screen as your way of also thanking our speaker. So we're next up is Wendy Moschetti, who's going to be talking about food systems and much more. So would like to share some background about her. As the Director of Strategic Initiatives, Wendy leads the development and implementation of Nourish Colorado's strategies related to food systems, food access, and food promotion. In 2009, Wendy launched her own consulting firm and has collaborated with numerous organizations across the state on a variety of projects aimed at leveraging our food systems to improve equitable access to healthy foods. So would you please welcome Wendy Moschetti.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Wendy speaking. And you can hear me okay, right? Okay, thanks. Great. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. Give me 1 second to pull up my PowerPoint. All right, here we go. Can you see this okay? Great. Hi. Hey, everybody. Thanks for that introduction, David. As he said, I am Wendy. And for my slides today, first of all, I probably have a few too many slides, so I might be going rapid fire through some of these and in the hopes that we have time for some robust conversation and Q&A at the end, and to leave ample time for my colleague Becca, who has some really rich things for us all to talk about. So what I just really want to briefly touch base with you all on today is a teeny bit high level touch on like who we are at Nourish Colorado, so you know who we are and what we do. Just talk a little bit about kind of why we do what we do, and that's because of some of the sort of deep imbalances and disparities that we see within our food systems that we think lead to pretty deep nutritional food insecurity, and then just talk a little bit about some of the really actually quite wonderful connections that we have seen come into play even, I think, stronger in a time of COVID between local communities, local agriculture, and to address things like food insecurity. So just again, really quickly, just a bit about us at Nourish Colorado. This is straight off of our website. Just a little bit about why we do what we do at Nourish Colorado. And you can check us out at nourishcolorado.org. But some of the issues that we sort of aim to address in our work are right here on our slide, are around compromised nutrition, right? That there's some deep disparities in economic insecurity that Julia just described a lot of across the state of Colorado that really limit individual purchasing power and can lead to very often compromising on nutritious foods, particularly in a state like Colorado, where housing prices, as we're all well aware, are pretty out of control. Oftentimes when you're forced to pay for something, you will prioritize other things, and healthy food is often something that you compromise on. Poor food environments is something we also work to address. Whereas community food environments that are very intentionally actually built to actually promote the less healthy option through marketing, physical infrastructure, and more. Also just imbalance sort of in the food system from federal policy on down that sort of results in federal supports for certain foods over others. And then disconnect in our food system. Some of our work aims to sort of reconnect people to their food and where it comes from as well. So then this is just a little bit about sort of then what do we do? Basically, our focus at Nourish Colorado is to work to ensure that each and every Coloradan has, as it says here, equal and abundant access to nutritious foods from sustainable sources. And we do that through statewide initiatives, lots and lots of partnerships, and doing policy advocacy at the state and federal level. Again, just high level, just a little about us. We do, as I mentioned, we do policy work at the state and federal level. We do work around primarily with early care and K-12 school food environment around sort of returning to scratch-based cooking and returning to and embracing local procurement in our institutions that feed our little ones. And then we focus a lot on healthy food incentives, which are programs like Double Up Food Bucks, which you may have heard of, which is a SNAP incentive program. And we work with other federal food assistance programs, basically to stretch food assistance dollars and increase access to produce, particularly through these programs. So I put this graphic in for Becca because she probably made it. I think this came out of the blueprint of food and agriculture in Colorado that Becca worked on. And I wanted to do a little bit of a tie here between what Julia's talking about and into the food system, because we're talking a lot about words today: food security, food insecurity, the food system. So just a high level touch on what the heck we mean when we talk about the food system. This is a very straightforward graphic. Thank you, Becca and team. That just sort of lays out the food system from not even just seed. We often talk about seed to table. So we're taking a step back when we talk about the food system here, is it really starts with those natural resources. It starts with your quality and your quantity of soil, of water, and of other natural resources. And then moving on down the line, it's then sort of like, what do you have to actually, what tools do you have? How are you manipulating or maneuvering or changing those natural resources on your production, on your farm and ranch? Moving into the bulk of our food system in the United States, which is processing and manufacturing, is where all the value add comes in, all of the processing we do to our food, obviously moving to distributing our food, then moving to points of sale, right? Restaurants, institutions, grocery stores, and then ultimately to us as consumers, and then all the way down into and then waste and all back in again. So anyway, that's a little bit about the food system. Sometimes it is hard for me to see the chat and my slides and all of you. So please feel free to just interrupt me. Anyone, if you see like there's a question or a comment in one of the chat boxes, please feel free to interrupt me anytime. So that's just a little bit about what we mean by the food system. And then I want to talk a little bit about, again, kind of why we do what we do at Nourish as well, is food system conundrums. So I'm going to talk about like conundrums and like sort of imbalances a bit. And I have a couple of quotes here that are actually from one report from 2017. And I've completely overused these quotes since 2017. But what happened in 2017, there's a global nonprofit called EAT, and the Lancet, which is a British medical journal, came together to form the EAT Lancet Commission with the Rockefeller Foundation. And the commission was focused on food, planet, and health. And their whole entire question was, can we feed a future population of 10 billion people a healthy diet within planetary boundaries? So their charge was really to look at something that is not still, even 4 years later, not super often looked at together, is how do we look at nutrition and sort of environmental issues as a package when we talk about the food system. And one of their leading articles when they launched this commission was called Very Straightforward, titled, and I have references to all of this in the slides you'll see them in my notes when you get the slides, but this article was called Food Systems, Nutrition, Health, and Environment. Like super straightforward. And so the couple of quotes that came out of this, I'm just going to read them, although you can see them, is the food system, just as the slide just showed, encompassing production, processing, marketing, purchase of food, and related consumer behaviors, resources, and institutions, appears to be struggling to deliver nutritious and healthy diets in an equitable manner. This is exactly some of the things that Julia just touched upon, as well as even if you can control for lots of different factors, but we see very disparate food environments and ultimately food consumption across the United States and globally. I also really like this quote. I'm sure some may disagree with it, but food is the single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth. And what this I think is powerful about this, well, it just points out how powerful food really is. Like food can be incredibly harmful to us as individuals, as our health, and it can be incredibly powerful to promote health. And food and how and where and how we produce it can have the same effects on planet Earth as well. There's some harm you can get from it, and there's some positive things that we can do. Just to note too, I'm not going to answer any of these questions, but ultimately the commission, which ultimately did promote like sort of a sustainable, healthy diet, which you can take a lot of issues with, by the way. There's a lot of concerns around sort of affordability and access with what they promoted, but they basically came to the conclusion that yes, we can totally feed this population a healthy diet within planetary boundaries if we make the necessary dietary changes, which is in their perspective, way less animal-based sources of food, way less processed foods, changes in food production, and way less food waste. So again, there's a site to it. But I just wanted to show this too, because what I thought was unique about this is their framework of environmental change, food system, nutrition, and health interactions. And I'm not really going to go into this, but just to flag it as I have the link in the slides that you will get. And what I like about it, even if you could take issue with some of their ultimate recommendations, is they're for the first time really trying to look at a theory of change here and work here that actually combines, when we talk about, there's a ton of research that talks about, diet and nutrition, right? And there's a ton of research that talks about like food systems and the environment, and not a lot that really looks at these as a package. So at least it's sort of starting that conversation. Oops, I'm gonna go to my next slide. So then just a little bit about sort of what we see as sort of imbalance in the food system. And again, a little bit about why we focus on what we do at Nourish Colorado. And again, these next two slides, they're just sort of bullet points, talking points. They're maybe more sort of compelling conversation starters than sort of in-depth data. But these are just the kind of things that we kind of chew on a lot, is that we live in a world that creates and has the ability to create an abundance of food. Like that is not really our issue, right? So in North America, we produce over 3,500 calories of food per person per day, way more than what sort of the average adult actually needs to consume per day. And yet, we live in a world and we live in a country where food insecurity, as you just heard from Julia, is everywhere. And I just put that note in this as well, that like, these are national statistics, 11 to 12% pre-COVID food insecure. According to Hunger Free Colorado, we are still experiencing pushing 40% food insecurity. And yet we also live in a world where, a country where 37% of Americans are obese, not just overweight, but obese. And only 1 in 10 adults eat the recommended number of servings of fruits and vegetables today. And as Julia pointed out, and I really appreciate your framing of that, Julia, is that there are significant disparities across all of these indicators for communities that are experiencing low incomes and for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And again, this is because there is a system in place that has created so there are deep disparities in terms of obesity rates, fruit and vegetable consumption, and food insecurity. And sorry, I'm having trouble with my slides. So just a few more things that we kind of chew on that sort of in our minds are sort of demonstrating this, we're a little bit out of whack in the United States with where sort of maybe our resources are and then the outcomes that we see. Are that small family farms, so small family farms count less than $350,000 annual gross cash farm income. So small family farms account for 90% of all US farms. They account for almost about half of farmland, but they only account for about 22% of the value of production. So the monetary value that your crops are given as they come off the farm. So to me, what's actually important is the flip of that, is that 10% of our farms account for, 88%, did I do that right? Of the value of production. So there's like just real severe and significant concentration in farming. A few others the data that I point out is that women as principal operators make up about 14% of all farms. Much more significant when you look at sort of spouses, if you're sort of a co-operator, but as principal operator, still only about 14%. So these top two data points are from, thank you, Becca, for flagging this for me, from a 2020 report from the USDA Economic Research Service that came out in December 2020. And interesting to me is that, so the report was called like the diversity amongst diversity amongst American family farmers. What was interesting to me about this report, it's something I think has to do with sort of that for a food system on up, the kind of, where we're building equities and inequities into our system, is that this report was all about diversity of American family farmers, and yet the only identity characteristic that they reported on was if you identified as male or female, and that was it. There were no other identity characteristics reported in this study at all. Maybe take it with a grain of salt. This was published by the former administration, so there's certain things the USDA probably did or did not want to talk about. But they did not report on race or ethnicity or anything else. We do know from 2017 ag census data that over 90% of principal operators are white. We know from that data as well in Colorado, it's about 88% of principal farm operators are white males. There's pretty disparate data then on terms of when you get to start talking about farm workers, who is growing, or people who are growing our food, depending on the source of data, both from 2018, and again, these are linked in my notes as well. It's anywhere between sort of 64%, 83% of farm workers are as the surveys report termed as of Hispanic origin. So we see pretty significant disparities in terms of, especially in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of ownership and operators, and then who was working the land on those farms as well. So again, these are just a few things that we kind of focus on to see, like, how are we sort of building this system from the ground on up, and like who is benefiting, maybe who is not, so we can sort of identify where some of those gaps are. And a couple things I wanted to touch upon as well, that building off what Julia talked about, and to get to your question, David, too, a little bit that you posed around how is this possible, right, in the state of Colorado? Like, why are there such disparities in terms of food security, right? And some people would say maybe particularly in the state of Colorado, who particularly pre-COVID had a pretty booming economy. So one thing I like to source a lot comes from, it's published by the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. It's from a process was put together by a center whose name I'm totally blanking at the University of Washington, but the Colorado Center on Law and Policy has adapted this tool to develop a self-sufficiency standard and to calculate it regularly for each county in the state of Colorado. The last I know, unless they've done it and not published it, is for 2018. So again, 2018 data pre-COVID. Julia, you're nodding, I hope that's right. So I have a couple slides here that focus, I picked Boulder County because I live there. I think it's super interesting. I also think it's important to look at a county that we usually think of as incredibly wealthy, which in many cases, in places and ways it is. And also I do talk to students at CU pretty regularly about this. And so we kind of focus on sort of their backyard and what really is going on in Boulder County. So these are some data from the self-sufficiency standard that I think demonstrate a little bit about why, to your question, David, do we see such insecurity with what you would think was pretty high wages, right? Pretty decent salaries. So as it says here, and you can see right here for yourself, is that in Boulder County, a family would need to make more than 3 times the federal poverty level to make ends meet. And one important thing to point out about sort of making ends meet here, what I like about the self-sufficiency standard, though it's kind of an interesting name, but is what they're trying to take into account is everything that you actually need to do to take care of yourself and your family, and to live a life free of some basic worries. So they're looking at, if you really want to be able to pay your rent every month, if you really want to be able to put decent food on the table, if you want to be able to get to your job and have transportation, if you want to be able to afford childcare, you want to have some basic healthcare. I think many people would agree these are pretty basic needs, but these do not go into defining the federal poverty level at all, right? This is, FPL has not kept pace with what it actually takes to like take care of yourself and your family in the United States today. And that's what I like about the self-sufficiency standard. And what it says here is just an example, is if you are a family with like 1 adult and 1 preschooler, you would need that annual income of over $60,000 to make ends meet, period. This isn't talking about like, oh, I live a luxury life and get to go to Mexico every spring break. This is the basics. What's more than 3 times the federal benchmark of $16,000 for a family of 2. So that's over 27% of households fall under the standard in Boulder County. So we can imagine maybe some other counties it's going to be much more steep. So it's just an example too, when you go into the self-sufficiency standard, what you can kind of play with it, which I like. So here I just sort of looked like, okay, what if you're 1 adult, 1 preschooler, and 1 school ager? In Boulder County, the self-sufficiency wage is almost $80,000. And I think most people can agree that if you made $80,000, you'd think you had a pretty good job and you were doing a really good job of taking care of yourself. But when you start breaking down the costs from housing and childcare and food and transportation and healthcare and everything else, it doesn't go very far anymore, particularly in the state of Colorado. We continue to sort of blow past other states in terms of cost of living, and particularly in housing. The other thing that Julia on some of your slides noticed, there's a pretty significant food insecurity reported between 19 and 29-year-olds. So this is just something I pulled from, many campuses have done this. CSU participated in this Real College survey in January 20, so right pre-COVID. So this is pre-COVID, so things probably got worse. But at CSU in Fort Collins, like 32% of CSU students experienced low or very low levels of food security within the previous month. 38% they couldn't afford to eat balanced meals, and 35% worry about running out of food before they had money to buy more. And I think you could joke a lot about like how college kids and balancing budgets and things and that, and the latest scorecard, right, and about state investment in public education, we got an F as a state. That is down from a D. And right before COVID, if you look at like US News World Report, we were like A+ state economy, right? So this is totally out of whack. we are actually driving students into poverty. And I'm sure there's much more to it. But I just think it's just always this example I use to sort of check some assumptions about where food insecurity lives and what it looks like. So I'm going to have a few more slides just to kind of show what's going on. Although I probably don't have a whole lot more time, but I did want to just talk a little bit about what we've seen in COVID that we think are just really beautiful, amazing responses to community food insecurity. And how I hope these are some of these connections that are really going to last sort of pre-COVID. So really quickly, I just wanted to share some data on one of our own initiatives, Double Up Food Box. It explains it here. It is an incentive for SNAP, formerly food stamps. So if you go to partner vendor, retailer, farmer's market, grocery store that we happen to work with, you could get extra dollars to spend on produce. And there is an incentive for Colorado grown produce. So we work a lot with growers directly, farmers markets, CSAs, things like that. So that's Double Up Food Bucks, and just a little bit of data on so in a time of COVID, summer 2020, even though shopping patterns went totally whack and everyone started changing everything, we distributed over $400,000 in Double Up Food Box to over 7,000 households in over 30 counties. So that was, we had 2,000 totally new people in summer 2020 that never used Double Up Food Box before. Obviously, SNAP participation was going up, and it was really sort of helping to meet a need in a time of COVID. And just some other data points here, and that what we see very consistently is that consumers that participate are reporting buying more, eating more produce, and also then the farmers that we work with report selling more fruits and vegetables, particularly at the farmers market level. Another initiative I just wanted to quickly mention that we do run is the Colorado Nutrition Incentive Program. This specifically works with WIC, so the Women, Infants, and Children's Program, and the Older Adult Congregate Meal Program. And basically we buy CSA shares. We pre-purchase weekly produce box deliveries for WIC and older adults. And in a time of COVID, thanks to infusion of state dollars, we purchased almost $500,000 worth of CSA shares from 41 different farmers and food hubs. And I flagged this because I just wanted to kind of share some of the quotes that come next here. And not surprisingly, what we see is really strong reports from participants that they're increasing their food security, they're increasing their produce consumption, and that growers are experiencing an increase in financial stability because they're participating in this program. So these are just a couple of examples of where we see really, I think, strong connections being made at the community level. So growers and farmers and feeding their communities. One other example I wanted to share is from the Colorado Farm and Food Systems Response Team. So this is a COVID response team for farm and food systems that I won't really go into, but part of what we did as a response team was 3 rounds of small grants for growers, for farmers, for intermediaries like food hubs and processors. And in the third round of the small grants, we asked how are you feeding your community? Are you addressing food insecurity? And I just love this slide because it just shows everyone at some point was reporting doing something to really address community food insecurity. And there's just a big sort of spectrum of things that people are doing, right? People are getting really creative. They're accepting Double Up Food Bucks. They're accepting SNAP. They're selling to WIC. They're selling to food pantries. They're clearly just donating to food pantries. So lots of different ways, even when they're probably experiencing financial insecurity themselves, the growers and intermediaries are really coming together in COVID to feed their communities. And then I just thought some of the results from round 3 too were interesting too, is that we just heard from grantees over and over again that they really saw themselves as providing critical value to the local economy, right? They're responding to food waste and storage needs. They're managing local distribution. They're employing local people, generally stabilizing the food chain, particularly at a time when maybe focusing on local sales could be a more stable business model in their minds. And I have a couple quotes that I won't read all of them, just some snippets, but I just love some of that. We get hundreds of quotes all the time. And some of them I just think really capture this incredible connection that we see going on even more so in COVID. And just the last half of this quote I'll read, I love, is that outside funding paved the way for meal programs to buy our food, for individuals to use SNAP and Double Up well beyond what we've seen previously, and for us to figure out how to break down bulk harvests into individual sales. We know now better who we feed, and we feel more appreciated and supported. We're more of the farm we want to be, which I think is pretty incredible and emotional. And then hearing from, say, a WIC participant that received some of these food boxes is, this year's our last year in the WIC program. We could not be more thankful for the farmers and all their hard work to provide this for us. The last quote here is from a grower and an intermediary at Gunnison County, right? Not only does this program give a boost to households with need, it also allows us to provide support to local producers who've also been negatively affected by the current pandemic, a true win-win. So we just saw a lot of this going on in a time of COVID. So I just kind of wanted to elevate some examples of where we just saw communities really coming together, and sort of that last quote said, truly in sort of a win-win way. So everyone is feeling more secure and stable and supported together. And then this last slide here, which I won't really talk about, it'll be in the slide deck, was more that if you want to get more involved specifically with sort of us at Nourish, the best way to, not the best way, one of the ways to do that is really through our policy work. So there's some links that you will get when you get the slides about getting our policy blogs, about signing up for our food bill action team, which meets twice a month for 30 minutes to talk about the latest and greatest policy action we can take. And you can always track our state and federal bill trackers. So just wanted to make sure that was in the slide deck. And I will stop talking and pass it back to David, who's going to pass it on to Becca. And unless I see there's some chats coming in, I don't know if anyone's had a time, if there anyone directed to me, or we can address them later.
Let's do that later. Yeah, if we may. Well, yeah, Paul's got a handle on that, I'm sure. Well, one more presentation. Dr. Becca Jablonski. Looking for my notes. She is an assistant professor and food systems economist at Colorado State University, and she is the co-lead of CSU's Food Systems Initiative. The Food Systems Initiative bridges research, extension, and education to identify and inform opportunities to bridge how the production, supply chains, and eaters respond to changing markets, policy, and environment. So please welcome Dr. Jablonski.
Thank you so much, David, and great to be with all of you today. And I really enjoyed listening to Julia and Wendy's presentations. Actually, I'm fortunate to get to work with Wendy a lot on a lot of different projects, so always nice to be on a panel with her. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the COVID-specific research that we've been doing in this area. And so I think it's actually a really nice complement to some of the things that Julia and Wendy touched on here, and then I'm happy to answer any questions at the end along with the other panelists. So I think that this is an image that we saw a lot at the beginning of the pandemic, right? There was a lot of concern because people went into grocery stores and they were not necessarily able to buy all of the different things that they are used to purchasing. Now we can talk about what sort of happened. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I will say that I think it was pretty remarkable how quickly our food supply chain was able to pivot, given some of the changes that we saw, and I'll show you a couple images to back that up in a second here. And that probably what actually caused these totally empty shelves in some cases was really due to some of the panic or binge purchasing, and not just in terms of the changes in sort of how people were shopping. But there is no question that there were changes in how people were shopping due to the pandemic and especially the social distancing measures. So this is some data that we've been using a lot during the pandemic in our department, in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. It's a little scary, it's a little big brother, but there's a company called Safegraph that has been making cell phone data available essentially 3 days after it tracks where your cell phone goes. And so we have access to a lot of this information. And so here what I'm showing you, the green line is 2019, the orange line is 2020, and then the blue line is 2021 to date. And here we're looking at people going to sit-down restaurants as tracked by where their cell phone goes. And so if you look at the green line, right, for 2019, you can see that there's some bumps, right, in terms of there was a little bit of uptick in August, but it's pretty consistent, right? Whereas if you look At the 2020 data, you can see that there's all of a sudden this sort of precipitous drop, right, when the pandemic hit. People stopped going to restaurants in part because of mandates. And so we could see that there's this big change, and now we're seeing an uptick again as many of the social distancing measures have been lifted. So really what I'm just trying to hammer home here is that, yes, things changed in how and what we were doing and how we were shopping and where we were going and getting food because of the pandemic. So as economists, we generally talk about two different types of places where we go and get food. We talk about food at home. So these are purchases that you make to prepare at home. So the general places that you go are like the places like Costco or those kinds of wholesale stores, or you go to places like retail stores, right? You're going to Walmart, or you're going to Safeway, and you're buying food to go and prepare at home. Food away from home is the other big place that people shop. And this is if you are at CSU and you go and eat at our cafeteria, or if you go eat at a sit-down restaurant or a fast food restaurant, right? Those are our food at home, food away from home. And so generally we think about food purchases in those two categories. A third category is around acquisitions. And this is food that you don't pay for, but that you acquire. And when you acquire food, it can either be for food at home consumption, or it can be for food away from home consumption. So for example, if you have a kid that qualifies for free meals at schools, that could be a food away from home acquisition. And if you have SNAP dollars, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the food stamp dollars, and you go and spend that at the grocery store, that could be a food at home acquisition. So when I'm going to talk about the data, I'm going to use these terms, but I wanted to make sure it was clear what I'm talking about. So this is some data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service. And what we're looking at with these blue bars are food at home purchases. The red bars are food away from home purchases. And then the green is total food sales. And so what you can see here is that, first of all, on average, food away from home actually represents over half of our total dollars that we spend in the United States. And this is really a shift from if you look at 10 years ago. So the amount of money that, or the share of our household expenditures on food has really shifted towards food away from home as opposed to food at home. Now, of course, that changed when the pandemic hit because, as I just said, people weren't going out to eat at restaurants as much. And so you can see here in sort of February and April, right, we see that, February, March, and April, you can see March, look at this food at home, right? The food at home really shot up. People were spending much more of their total food dollar expenditures on places like grocery stores, right, or places like Costco. Interestingly, if you look at then the total spend, you can see that total food sales actually declined, right? It really dropped to its lowest level between 2019 and 2020 in around April. And this is because if you go and purchase the ingredients to make a hamburger, for example, and you purchase those ingredients and you cook it at home, that hamburger is a lot cheaper than if you go out to a restaurant and you purchase that same hamburger, right? You go and sit down restaurant, because there's a lot of value added that goes into it. And so what we saw is that, like, as of November 2020, U.S. food spending was almost $7 billion less than in November of 2019. So the total amount we were spending on food actually declined. And that's a much smaller gap than if you look at June 2020 compared to June 2019, where that gap was about $12 billion. And so anyway, there were these really important changes. And I think because these changes happened almost overnight, there were a lot of discussions that were taking place at the state level and at the federal level. And so CSU formed a Colorado Food Supply Task Force, and I led that task force to really try to provide rapid response research to questions that the governor and the commissioner of agriculture had. And we also provided a lot of information to the Senate Ag Committee and the U.S. Department of Agriculture about some of these changes, and I'm going to talk about some of that. I just did want to highlight, though, that for the Colorado-specific resources, you can access them on our Food Systems website here, foodsystems.colorado-state.edu, and just go over to the COVID-19 tab. So nationally, one of the places that we played a large supporting role was for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Marketing Service. So you probably heard a lot that because people saw, go back to that beginning slide I showed you, sort of those images of those empty shelves, I think there was a shift in thinking about what was available more locally that people could get access to. And especially because a lot of local food is provided by smaller mid-scale farms, and they also tend to take on more of those supply chain pieces, so they do more of their own marketing or processing or distribution. So they were able to pivot more quickly than maybe some of the larger players were. And so as a result, there was a lot more interest in local and regional food systems. And so this team was established to really try to understand what were some of the pivots that were happening, what were some of the innovations, and what were some of the places where there was additional support required. And so this team included still includes 3 university partners. It also includes 17 communities of practice. These are groups that tend to coordinate a lot of the local food networks. So it includes things like we have the Farmers Market Coalition. We have the CSA Innovation Network. We have the James Beard Network, which James Beard Foundation represents independent restaurants, et cetera. We also had the representatives of all of the state departments of agriculture. And so it's been a great group to work with. One of the pieces of things that we did as part of this work was to do a consumer survey of 5,000 households nationally. So it's a representative sample, but note that we actually tried to get more women respondents than men, and this is because women tend to still do more of the shopping overall than do men. But this is some of the breakdown of demographics by income and race. We had most of our Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish origin respondents responded in this white category. And so we actually further broke down those responses in terms of how they identify. So we asked about 3 different time periods in this survey. We asked about September 2019, which we're calling the before times, right, where life was groovy. We asked about April 2020, which is the start of the pandemic. And then we asked about September 2020, the unfortunate new normal. And so we could track then some of the changes over time. We have lots of information here on the website. I'm only going to highlight today some of the information that actually pertains to questions around food security. So in terms of our food insecure respondents, I think one of the really interesting things that we saw is that about 2/3 of our sample reported that they experienced some kind of change, of our food insecure households experienced some kind of change in employment status or in income. And so actually, it's almost 60% of our food insecure households could be classified as low income, but over 40% couldn't. And so if you think about this, these are people who were not low income prior to the pandemic, right? But they probably experienced some kind of change in employment, right? Or in income, they had some kind of income loss. And therefore they became food insecure and low income as part of the pandemic, right? And I think that meshes pretty well with some of the things that Julia mentioned, right? That like if you're looking at 2019 data, that it probably doesn't accurately or fully reflect the extent of food insecurity that's taken place since the pandemic really started. So we tried to look at things about where people who were food secure and food insecure were shopping, right? Where were they getting their food? And we looked at those food at home and food away from home venues. I think some of the more interesting differences we see across food security status, for example, are there are many more of our food insecure households that are shopping at places like discount stores, right? Those are places like Dollar Tree or Dollar General compared to our food secure sample. We actually also saw that more of our food insecure sample was shopping at health or natural food stores, which we found to be a little bit surprising, and more of them were shopping direct from producer. You know, and this may be reflective, we don't know for sure, but for programs like what Wendy talked about, right, that there were a number of these new opportunities that were made available because of government funds to actually find opportunities to purchase directly from producer or to participate in some of these food box programs, right? And so we really do see a lot of differences there in terms of market channel selection. We've been trying to think about breaking down the data in a number of different ways to help inform our analysis. And one of the things that we've looked at are changes in time use. So we asked questions about time spent procuring and preparing food. And one of the reasons we do this is that the literature talks about, the academic literature talks about the importance of time use in terms of food insecurity, right? That sometimes we create interventions that actually require more time on the behalf of people who are already food insecure and are already working 3 or 4 jobs. And so what we're trying to think about is, are some of these market channels actually more time and labor intensive than others? Because what that may end up doing is actually pushing food insecure individuals to go places more like fast food restaurants, right, which tend to be easier, but they tend to be less nutritious. And actually one of the shifts in the literature recently, and I think in practice, has been moving away from this term around food security to talking about nutrition security. And I think that's a really, really important distinction, and we could talk about that a little bit more when we get to the Q&A piece. So if we're looking at so the FAH is food at home, and the FAFH is food away from home. And so we can see here that if we're looking at the September 2020, right, so that's the new normal times, that across for the food secure population, we see that they're spending more time, right, on food at home, and they're spending less time for food away from home, which is what you'd expect, right, because they're probably spending more time at their house and therefore have more time cooking. We do not see any significant differences, though, across our food insecure population. And here, we actually try to break it out a little bit more to see, for those that are using SNAP or EBT or WIC, and so these are different programs that we can talk about more in a second, that households whose time restriction did not lessen, right, so that they didn't find that they had more time, they actually use SNAP. And what we think actually is that because SNAP was put online, that there were a number of opportunities through policy as part of COVID and some of the changes that took place and the expediting of getting SNAP online, that SNAP actually became a relatively easy and non-time intensive measure for people to use benefits. WIC, unfortunately, did not have the same kinds of policy support. So WIC, for example, was not made easier to use. And therefore, we think, SNAP, some of these changes that were made to SNAP seem to have really made a difference in terms of the time burden placed in food insecure households. And then I also wanted to show you this. So here we're looking at where some of these food insecure households were acquiring food. And so for the folks that, for the food insecure households that did increase the time that they were spending on preparing and procuring food, they were more likely to acquire food at food banks, which we were actually surprised about, right? And they were more likely to acquire food through school meal programs. And, I think that part of this may be attributable to the fact that if you look at what our municipalities and our schools tried to do in terms of pivoting, I think at first, many of them felt like they weren't very successful, right? Because what they tried to do was to actually have a smaller segment of the number of schools providing those meals. And they quickly realized that that was too labor intensive, right? Because now parents, for example, who weren't taking their kids to school had to go to a school just to pick up meals. And it may not have been even the school that was closest to their house. But those schools did some pivoting and actually then were doing more delivery, and that actually may have actually worked for a number of those households. So I think the bottom line is that there really were some good things that were done by some of these municipalities, I think, to support a number of the households that are low income and food insecure. And I'm sorry, I'm not monitoring the chat box right now, but I'm happy to answer questions as they come in a second here. Wendy and Julia can answer them for me. So that was from our national work, and I wanted to talk then a little bit more about these school closures, because I think this is a really important point, right? So the schools closed, right, essentially overnight, and had to make decisions about, these school meals are really important for low-income households, right? So the National School Lunch Program is the second largest food and nutrition assistance program in the United States. It feeds 84% of low-income food insecure households with school-aged kids, right? So this is a really important program. And for the students that actually do receive their lunch at school, they get about a third of their daily calories through these school meals. So again, really important. And actually, I'm not going to show it to you here, but we do also see that for the low-income household kids that are acquiring these meals, that it actually increases the dietary quality of their overall meals that they get, or the overall calories that they get, as measured by the HEI score, the Healthy Eating Index. And so most studies find that the National School Lunch Program is associated with lower rates of food insecurity for households with kids, as well as improved dietary quality and academic performance. So when these schools closed, I think mostly we heard about like concerns around learning outcomes, but there was a real concern around how these low-income, the households with low-income kids were going to get enough food to sustain themselves. So the USDA's Food and Nutrition Service made some, I think, very good decisions very quickly around having more flexibility in their programming and reimbursement. So just to give you one quick example, generally schools get reimbursed based on what they call sort of butts and seats, right? So you have to actually have a kid that's sitting there and the school has to count it, and then the school can get reimbursed for that. Well, that was changed. You no longer had to prove that the kid was there. A parent could go without showing any sort of documentation, and they could pick up multiple meals for multiple kids without the meal being there. So that was great. I think the challenge was that there was no federal guidance on what the schools should do. And as a result, we ended up with a patchwork of emergency feeding programs across the U.S. Some were more and less successful, right? And so now we're trying to really learn from what did we see as more successful or less successful. And so I was part of a team including 5 cities across the U.S. Denver was one of those cities, where we looked at indicators of effectiveness. And we essentially came up with 3 things, and I have a published paper on this that I'm happy to share if anyone's interested in reading the article. But one is cross-sector collaboration, the second was adaptable supply chains, and the third was addressing gaps in services to increase risk populations. So just to highlight this, you heard from the Colorado Blueprint to End Hunger, for example. I think David mentioned a few months ago or a year ago or something. And I think because of the work that folks like Wendy and others have done, there are really strong networks in Colorado prior to the pandemic. And so especially if you talk to the city and county of Denver, they can talk about the fact that they already had people that were coming to the table prior to the pandemic. So then when the shift occurred, there was already trust that had been built there. And so that they could do these things called needs and haves coordination, right? Where an organization could say, hey, we need this, and another organization could say, we have this, and they could do sharing, and that actually worked pretty effectively. It also supported strategic placement of these additional emergency feeding sites. As I mentioned, for example, when Denver Public Schools closed, I think that they recognized pretty quickly that they were feeding less than a quarter of the kids that qualified for free and reduced meals who were previously getting them in schools. And so they had to figure out quickly, like, how do we respond? What we're doing isn't working. And so they were able to coordinate to improve that at least. The second thing is that around adaptable supply chains, we saw that there were 2 supply chain issues that really impacted the effectiveness of these emergency feeding programs. One is that larger networks with more buying power appeared less likely to experience supply chain challenges, right? So if you think about a food bank, for example, which is a distribution hub, right, compared to a food pantry, the food banks had a lot more power than those food pantries did, and the food banks had a lot more ability to get food and actually distribute it. And here's an example from the city and county of Denver. And so what you can see is that during the pandemic, a huge number of the food pantries in the city and county of Denver actually closed, right? So you saw 62 of the 106 food pantries that were in operation prior to the pandemic continued to be in operation in July 2020. And at least anecdotally, what we heard is that Feeding America, which is really the network of the food banks, essentially realized that the pandemic was going to increase the need for their services, and they thought they were not going to be able to as efficiently provide support to each of the smaller food pantries given this increased need and provision. And so what Feeding America recommended to some of the food banks was actually to serve a smaller number of food banks. And that strategy was effective in the sense that the food banks were able to serve a much larger volume of people who needed it. I think the challenges that may have occurred because of this is that there may have been food pantries in particular neighborhoods that service particular populations that were therefore underserved, but we need to do a lot more digging into that. The second challenge is that feeding programs often rely on volunteer labor, and that created a number of challenges during the pandemic, especially as that volunteer labor tends to be in that high-risk population, especially as older adults. And then the last thing here is really addressing gaps in service to increased risk populations, right? I think you heard eloquently from both Julia and Wendy about COVID-19 highlighted these longstanding systematic health and social inequities, right, that put some racial and ethnic minority groups at increased risk. But Denver, I think because it had these networks in place, has really worked hard to prioritize documenting unmet and emergency needs. And this has not been true for every city across the U.S. And so thinking about sort of how this planning works and making sure we're thinking about the planning effectively in the future is going to be really important. And so last, I just wanted to say that we recently completed a survey of about 1,500 low-income households in Denver. We're still doing the data analysis there, but we asked a number of questions around changes in dietary quality and where they were both purchasing and acquiring food. And so we'll have some information that we really hope is going to be helpful moving forward here pretty quickly. So as I said, if you want to get more information about our COVID-19 research and data and other things, I encourage you to visit our website. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Becca. And take a minute to find a thumb up or a applause symbol. Wow, this has been a feast here to listen to the three of you. So now take a minute or two, perhaps more, for the three of you to have some conversation, and we'll listen in and then turn to the questions in the chat here in just a few minutes. So
I have a quick question for Julia, if that's okay, just a clarification question.
Sure.
Julia, that I think it was your last slide before your contact information that was talking about food insecurity by demographic or by age. So am I reading that slide correctly? Was it over 50% of people in the, like, I can't remember exactly what the age group was, but like the 25-year-olds that were food insecure?
Yeah, so they have, yeah, so it's really astonishing. So and I guess as a point of context, so the Hunger Free Colorado survey that I'm referencing, they've done 3 sort of quarterly surveys since the onset of the pandemic. This one that I referenced in my slides is from December 2020. Sample size is somewhere around 560 Coloradan households, representative sample. And so there is a little bit of margin of error in some of those numbers, but yeah, it's among 18 to 24-year-olds is 58%, so like 6 out of 10 folks in that age group. 25 to 34-year-olds, it's 50%, 35 to 44-year-olds is back up to 57%. So another way of saying that is folks 18 to 44%, more than half of people who were surveyed in that age range reported experiencing food insecurity, which is, yeah, really astonishing. And I think when we think about the sectors and the jobs that were most impacted by the pandemic, things like restaurant closures, for example, and people who had service industry jobs, perhaps those younger folks are sort of skewing more towards those sectors relative to people 45 and older.
Okay, Wendy, did you have a follow-up question or comment for the other two, or shall we go to the chat otherwise?
Please go to the chat.
All right.
Or open it up.
Paul, it's all yours. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll ask people to unmute themselves in a minute, but there was one comment from, well, that was you, Julie. No, from Ann Anderson, stating something about, more a comment, I think, access is a problem really felt during COVID times, but I can see that would be a problem always for shut-ins without others that can bring food to the house. I mean, it's more a comment than anything else here. I don't know if you want to add to that or what. And then there was other comments that I made regarding the ownership, national and Colorado. I was sort of surprised how how dominant it was by white. And those were answered in chat as well. And I guess there's a movement to help Blacks, but what about help for Latinx people?
You know, I'll just comment on that too. I shared a link that describes a little bit about one bill that's introduced at the federal level, which is called the Justice for Black Farmers Act. And that's the one I linked to in there. There is separately at the same time a bill that was introduced called Equity for Farmers of Color. And the bulk of that introduced bill was sort of integrated into the American Rescue Plan. So there are pieces and parts of the Equity for Farmers of Color integrated into that. And the first thing, one of the early things that we're seeing right now is debt relief for farmers of color. That's sort of one of the big first things that that is coming out of the American Rescue Plan right now as part of the Equity for Farmers of Color piece. Yeah. So there are some definitely in COVID response. It's not everything, but it is COVID response. There's definitely some pieces and parts in COVID response.
Thank you. And Native Americans, are they mostly self-sustaining?
No. Oh, go ahead, Becca.
No, well, two things about that. One is that Native American is a more challenging thing to measure because many of, like, for example, like a ranch would be tribal owned and not owned by an individual. And so you're not necessarily comparing apples to apples in terms of if you look at just the numbers. I also just wanted to mention that this is an economic series, so I can get a little nerdy on the data, but the Census of Agriculture has changed the way that they ask about operators. So the 2017 data makes it a little bit more challenging. I mean, Wendy is absolutely right that it's a very small percentage overall that are, are operations that are owned by people of color. But it's also, you basically can't compare over time because of some of the changes to the question.
And I'd add to that too, that I just think that, well, first of all, it was 2017 Ag Census data. So a lot has changed in the last 4 years. And the reach even there is limited, right? We know that there's even sort of maybe underrepresentation in some of these surveys of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So there could be skewed actually in a better direction, right? There could be actually more representation than we're actually capturing. And if you even look sort of in Colorado in the past few years, there's been an increase in maybe not owned, but lead operated by people of color farms in the state of Colorado.
The other thing is that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has not done a good job collecting information on urban agriculture. And now as part of the most recent Farm Bill, there was a creation of, I can't remember what it's called, Wendy, you can correct me here, but it's essentially an urban agriculture task force that now has been given some resources and they've made some of their first grants. But there is now a more concerted effort to thinking about how to collect data from urban operations. It just sort of has fallen in between a lot of different jurisdictions, like it wasn't covered under HUD and USDA, et cetera.
I just wanted to acknowledge Tim's comments. I think it was mostly just a comment, not a question, but that, yeah, there's, root of the problem appears to be in the financial system. And how we have built the system, I couldn't agree more, Tim, is that all the home budget goes to rent, childcare, taxes, and those claiming priority, position for payment, absolutely. I did a poor job of trying to illustrate that early on, but you do see food in some cases does seem to be, I don't think people really feel that it's expendable, but if you really are squeezed into that position of, am I gonna pay my rent? Am I gonna be able to get to my job? And am I gonna be able to pay my childcare provider? Those are the obvious choices. And then not even just, obviously you're gonna buy food, but then you're squeezed even more in terms of living in a society that places all sorts of value and support on highly processed foods that are easily accessible by all definitions of accessible, right? They're financially accessible, they're physically accessible, they're marketed and promoted to us and our kids all the time. So if you're already squeezed on food, period, but you live, in a society where we make it very, very easy to make the less healthy choice, we are really intentionally intentionally using food to harm people. So anyway, I just wanted to honor, acknowledge your statement, Tim. I don't know if you have a follow-up question.
As opposed to learning to make it from scratch, right?
Which has all sorts of reasons why this is maybe sort of, you talk about the lost art of scratch cooking, and it's we make it really, really difficult to do that, whether it's because where and how you find all of the right products. And to scratch cook, you actually need a wide array of things, right? Both tools and equipment and kitchen access, as well as all the raw ingredients and the spices that maybe in themselves are very affordable, like calorically, right? But you do need a lot of things at your disposal to really cook in a scratch cooking in a way that you and your family and your kids want to eat. It's just not the way that we sort of prioritize or make it easy to do.
Well, I just want to add, though, that, and I was trying to get at this in the talk I just gave, is that time, right? If you're working 3 or 4 jobs, scratch cooking is not necessarily available to you. And so, this relationship between time availability and both food security as well as that nutritional security piece, right? That there's a relationship there that is really important, because I think sometimes this does not address the systemic issue, but a lot of times there are sort of Band-Aid solutions that have to do with like creating your own garden, right? But if you're talking about a population that already doesn't have enough time, right, does that seem to be the right intervention? And so I think we really, I think there's sort of 2 conversations that have to happen concomitantly, right? And one is sort of these longer term issues, right, around making sure that people have, good jobs, good education, right? I mean, those are the issues that are going to help change these issues long term. There's also then the short term that we should not have anybody that is going hungry, right, in the United States or anywhere in the world, but especially in a country as rich as the United States. And so we need to figure out how to address those things, but we sometimes come up with these interventions that we find that are happening in one place. We then blanketly apply them around, in different places, and those interventions don't actually make sense for the population that is food insecure. And so we really need to spend time. I think Julia showed some data about the heterogeneity of food insecurity. We did a study in Pueblo with Wendy, this is now a lot of years ago, right, where we look at these sub-characteristics of the populations that are food insecure, and they need very different types of interventions, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
I need to step in now as a timekeeper, one of my functions, to let us all know that we have just a couple of minutes left. I'd like to give each of the other 2 panelists, Becca, if I may, we'll take that as your final word here for the group. Wendy, Julia, and then we'll, as Judy Woodruff says at the end of PBS NewsHour, we'll have to leave it there. So who'd like to go first? Wendy, how about your takeaway for this group?
Oh my gosh, I'm not prepared to be that profound. I'm sorry. I think I love that you're here. I love you're part of the conversation. Please reach out if you have any questions or comments, and if you love to do policy work, we love more voices all the time. So get involved.
Many thanks. Julia.
I guess I would just say the thing that excites me so much about food access work or food systems related work is that, particularly as someone who's coming from sort of a public health space, is that food as an issue is there's so many access points and so many sort of like themes or interest areas that I think people can tie back to food. And so whether you care about racial justice or socioeconomic mobility or environmental issues or labor rights or gender issues or what have you, like all food and food systems are, those issues are rooted in food and food systems at the end of the day. And so the extent to which those of us who don't occupy or operate in sort of fully food grounded sectors or jobs or what have you, there are still these intersections and opportunities to plug in and bring our passions and bring our expertise to the conversations and work that are happening around food systems, which I think is really exciting and I think is also really essential to sort of tackling these wicked issues that folks have been talking about today. So thanks all for being here.
Becca, it wouldn't be fair for me not to have you have a chance to sum up. And let me add that we will comb through the chat. So if there are questions that did not get addressed, we will get back to you. So Becca, you have the last word.
No, I just thank you, David, for organizing this. This is a lot of fun.
Oh, well, all right, many thanks. And again, use your reaction button if you want to extend a final thank you to our panelists. And there you see our website once again. Note too that we are not going to meet again until the fall. Date and time have not yet been decided. We welcome your suggestions, ideas for speakers, themes, etc. So thank you all, and we will hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.